Well, with me in the studio this hour, Avi Melamed is the founder of Inside the Middle East Institute. We're also joined by our correspondent, Ariel Levin-Wellman. Welcome to you both. Avi, if I could ask you about what's happening inside Gaza this hour. I think for another hour, Israel will be overseeing a humanitarian corridor, allowing civilians to move south from the north. Your thoughts on that?
Well, it's part of the combined Israeli master plan to operate in Gaza Street, meaning at the same time we are completing the encirclement of Hamas leadership and major headquarters in Gaza City. At the same time, Israel is trying as much as possible to encourage Palestinian civilians who are not involved in the fight to move and to go down to the southern part of Gaza Strip. That will help Israel in the next phase of the fight, particularly when we're looking at what's going to happen in Gaza City, because we want, of course, to make sure that there will be as less as possible civilians attending in the area of Gaza City once this fight is going to expand there.
Does this complicate the military offensive, or does this actually work in Israel's favor?
Well, I think it's part of the planning. It was very clear for me that from the beginning, it was very clear for the master plans, those who plans the military action, that they will have to make sure that there is going to be a corridor enabling those people from this part of Gaza City to move down to the south. So I would say this is part of the military plan. I don't think it's basically substantially interrupt or disorder the Israeli military plan.
And in terms of the military offensive, to what extent is the IDF in control of Gaza City now?
Look, again, I don't have the blueprints, of course, but I think that based upon the information coming in from my sources, I think that we can say that at this point, the IDF is quite satisfied with the pace of the movement on the ground, with the achievements that have been achieved on the ground. At this point, I think that we can start look at the next phase, meaning in the sense of like once this encirclement of Gaza City is completed, what will be the next phase of the IDF? We have to remember something very significant. Right now, the major focus is the area of Gaza City and the north part of Gaza City, but we'll still have the part of South Gaza, where for the time being, relatively speaking, though the Israeli Defense Forces are operating there, it's in a much more smaller scale in comparison to the northern and central part of Gaza Street.
And Ariel, the strategy so far has been to kind of cut Gaza in half, the northern part and the southern part, allowing the IDF forces to kind of zone in on those Hamas command centers in northern Gaza.
Absolutely, and because trying to tackle Gaza as a whole, when you have, at least as Hamas advertises, 40,000 fighters in entrenched positions, that they know the lay of the land, that they've prepared all the ambushes, is not a very pleasant proposition for the Israeli military forces. But if you divide it into sectors and you take one sector at a time, you can devote more of your military assets per sector at any given moment. Once that area is clear, you can move to the next. They call it sort of slicing the pie as a strategy, and this allows them to cover more ground with less actual forces in any given location, allowing them to bring much greater force to bear on any given location, lets them clear it out. And we've seen the effects of this strategy, at least in part, because by cutting off northern Gaza, you've also cut off a lot of the rocket launching positions, something that people in Israel Center have definitely noticed over the past week or so. Remember that at the beginning of the conflict, we were getting about 3 rocket barrages every single day, almost like clockwork, 2 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and then 10 o'clock. Now at times we get maybe 1 barrage every 2 days in Israel Center, and anything north of that, obviously people in the south are still under fire. But that's because there's fewer opportunities, fewer positions in range of the center of Israel from where Hamas is still operating with impunity.
And Avi, you've got hundreds of kilometers of Hamas tunnels where the Hamas fighters are hiding, far beneath the ground. Just to pick up on something that Daniel Hagari, the IDF spokesman, said yesterday, it's the engineering forces, isn't it, which are going in, doing the hard work, tunnel by tunnel, destroying them, seizing weapons. This will be a long, long war, won't it?
It is. It's a long process, but here is something that we have to say about the whole issue of the tunnels, the challenge of the tunnel. For Hamas, the tunnels are a major asset, but what happens in course of time when Israel is chewing more and more Hamas assets and basically limiting more and more Hamas maneuvering, the tunnels are becoming also at the same time a bigger challenge for Hamas itself. Because in the end of the day, once there is a growing and intensifying, and there is a growing and intensifying Israeli military presence on the ground, which basically put much more pressure, increasing pressure on Hamas, and particularly the militants under the ground, they are basically coming to the point where they have to basically decide whether they are going to stay in the ground, under the ground, in the tunnels, and expect what should be Israel's next move, or they should try to go out. The moment they are doing that, they are much more exposed, and therefore they can be eliminated. And there is one more thing about the tunnels that we have to understand. Those tunnels are dug according to some specific logic. And if they are dug according to some specific logic, you can, in a reverse engineering, understand what the logic beyond the tunnels, and apparently you could apply the means to take care of that.
Okay, all right, thank you, Avi. We're going to go to the south of Israel now. Our correspondent Pierre Kloschendler joins us now. So Pierre, just talk us through the gains of the IDF forces overnight. And we have had some reports of rockets being fired in the last hour, is that correct?
Right, that's correct. A few moments ago, there was a rocket strike on a kibbutz, Mefalsim, which is not far away from where we are, and the bad wind of rocket fire has now switched southward towards the communities that are facing the southern sector of the Gaza Strip. Right now, there is ferocious fighting in the Shati, or beach camp, refugee camp, which is just the northern gate of Gaza City along the Mediterranean coast. This is according to Palestinian reports. Palestinians are also reporting that tonight there was something like 250 aerial attacks against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad targets all across the Gaza Strip, not just in the northern part of it, but also in the southern part of it, such as in Khan Younis and Rafah.
And Pierre, the IDF has released footage showing, I'm not sure if it's hundreds or dozens or more, of Palestinian civilians moving south via that corridor that Israel is supervising. We've seen Israeli tanks kind of overseeing that civilian movement. That corridor will be open for just under another hour. Tell us a bit about that.
Right, the coordinator of activities in the Israeli army vis-à-vis the Palestinians says that there are 1,000 using that corridor today, which could be maybe an uptick in the number of people that decide to voluntarily displace themselves and leave the battleground to safer zones in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. It's the fourth consecutive day that the Israeli army has opened that humanitarian corridor on the Salah ad-Din axis, which cuts across the northern part of the Gaza Strip toward the south in the center east sector of the Gaza Strip. Now, up until now, there were some problems because Hamas was firing mortar fire and only tens of people, maybe hundreds of people managed to cross towards the south safer zones. But now the Israeli army is in full control of that axis, and in the pictures that the IDF is releasing, you can clearly see the Israeli tanks guarding that axis, and you see people raising their hands with no equipment, no luggage at all, brandishing a white flag and crossing by foot that dangerous zone in order to find a safe haven somewhere, maybe with UNRWA as it's establishing tents for those who displace themselves, or maybe in the designated area by the IDF of the Al-Muasi beach, which is southwest of Rafah. Now, the thing is, it has a double purpose, I would say. First of all, indeed, to try and entice the population to leave the battleground in order to minimize casualties. There's been millions of SMSs, millions of WhatsApp messages, millions of leaflet drops over Gaza to call the population to leave the battleground. And The second goal is probably also, in a sense, to deflect the mounting international pressure exerted on Israel to agree for a tactical humanitarian pause, ceasefire, you name it. Although Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on ABC said overnight that it does not negate the possibility of opening a tactical humanitarian pause for the civilians of Gaza. But that's under discussions, and there's a lot of nitty-gritty questions to be solved. That's from Anthony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, who said that it's still in the process. So, meanwhile, the Israeli army opens unilaterally that corridor. Hamas is absolutely not committed to it, but it seems to be working, at least today, because there is full IDF control over the Salahuddin axis.
And Pierre, if I could just ask you briefly, I mean, while we're talking about humanitarian relief for Gazan civilians, the United Arab Emirates has sent 5 aircraft. They intend to set up a field hospital inside Gaza. Do you have any information on that?
Right, it's a move that has been coordinated with Israel, as Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed is actually the only Arab leader with whom Benjamin Netanyahu had a phone conversation since the beginning of the war declared by Hamas on Israel in October 7. So, yes, it's been coordinated with Israel. The planes carrying the equipment to establish that field hospital inside Gaza, in the southern Gaza Strip, has landed in the El Arish airfield in the northern Sinai in Egypt, and the material, the equipment, and the supplies should cross the Rafah terminal in order to, as fast as possible, establish the first field hospital ever created since the beginning of the hostilities. Now, there are also humanitarian trucks crossing the Rafah terminal for quite a few days already with food, water, and medical supplies. Yesterday, there were 93 trucks. The day before, there were 75 trucks. The goal is to reach the Rafah terminal full capability, which is about 100 trucks a day. And this is what the UN has requested. And we're getting close to that.
Pierre Clochender, thank you very much indeed for all the latest on Gaza. Just to draw your attention to a report coming in now, there's been an attempted terrorist attack in the Israeli West Bank settlement of Ofra. A man armed with a knife reportedly tried to enter the community. We don't know if it was IDF soldiers or a private contractor who shot at him. I believe the man survived and has gone back to his village where he came from. We'll keep you updated on that. Avi Melamed and Ariel Levy-Wellman with me in the studio. And Avi, we'll talk about Hamas's rocket capabilities in a moment, but I just wanted to ask you about some comments made by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and reinforced by the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant about the level of security control Israel intends to have over Gaza once the war with Hamas is over. What do you make of that?
What I understand from that is that Israel basically says, look, once we are done with crushing the major military spine of Hamas, we understand that it's not the end of the story yet, because there will be remains, sort of speaking. There will be cells. There will be an attempt to rebuild and to reactivate Hamas and Islamic Jihad military capacities. The idea is basically that Israel will not fully control the Gaza Strip following that, but basically Israel will have the free ability to operate in Gaza Strip, to intercept, to hunt down, to catch remains or cells of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other. The presence of Israel in Gaza Strip post the crushing of Hamas military spine will enable Israel more easily to chase those people, to hunt them down, and basically to make sure that they will not be able to rebuild this whole infrastructure.
Will that not lead to accusations that Israel is occupying the Gaza Strip?
It may lead to the accusations, but we have to remember that at the end of the day, it's not that Israel will be there solely alone. There will be other players on the ground as part of these arrangements of the post-war day, and Israel, as part of those arrangements, will be able to continue and to operate on the ground for intercepting, for hunting down, and for preventing the establishing of a military infrastructure of Hamas and Islamic Jihad.
I mean, they still have a great deal of military infrastructure on the ground to clear out first. And as of now, we certainly know that Israel's so-called partners in the region don't really want too much to do with Gaza.
You're referring to Egypt and Jordan.
So that actually finding people to assist Israel might be a bigger challenge than Israel hopes it to be. But no matter what you do, you are going to be facing accusations from the world stage, because ultimately part of this war is being fought in public opinion battles. And it's an enemy that's been very effective at those public opinion battles in the past, throwing all kinds of charges that don't hold up to closer scrutiny. There's no reason to believe this would be any different, but ultimately Israel has a responsibility to its own citizens to promote security, and if that comes with allegations and accusations of occupation, ultimately there's no real choice in the matter.
Okay, all right, well, let's talk a bit about Hamas's rocket capabilities, because for the past 31 days, Hamas and other terrorist groups in Gaza have been firing rockets at Israel's population centres almost daily. The vast majority have been intercepted by the Iron Dome missile defence system, but each time millions of Israelis are forced to flee to bomb shelters, and the rockets keep coming even after unprecedented airstrikes on Gaza. And as Ariel, you were pointing out, the frequency of those missile firing capabilities have come down a lot, but we are still seeing sporadic rocket fire, aren't we?
Absolutely. One of the big discussions we've had in this studio, including with you, Avi, is how many rockets does Hamas have? And even the conservative estimates were at 15,000, most putting it 20 or more. How much have they fired so far in this conflict? The answer is about 7,500, maybe more than that. The issue is you're still looking at maybe you've depleted half of their stockpile, maybe 1/3. Their capabilities are not actually diminished enough to say they're out of the fight yet or anytime soon. What's happened is that by cutting off northern Gaza from Hamas to have any freedom of operation, they still have some limited operations there, at least above ground, significant underground, it means that they can't put their launchers as close to Israel, at least as further north as they'd like to, which means they're restricted to making launches from the south. If you're launching from the south, you only have access to your longer range stockpiles if you want to hit Israel's center. And they don't have as many of those. Remember, the majority of Hamas's rockets are the locally produced Qassam variants. They have a number of Grads, they have a number of Fajrs from Iran. Those are the much longer range ones they're currently using to bombard Tel Aviv and the like. We don't know the percentage, but it's much less than their domestically produced ones. And while they are still producing more at home, with Israel operating militarily above ground, they don't have nearly as much freedom to do so.
So they are now forced to fire rockets from the south of the Gaza Strip, given that the IDF is active in the north. That, of course, is where most of the Palestinian civilians have sought refuge. So these rockets are not only a danger to Israel, they are a danger to the people in Gaza as well, aren't they?
Yeah, and we have to add another significant information. The Israeli spokesperson basically indicated that more than 1,000 rockets of Hamas and Islamic Jihad were basically falling down inside Gaza. It was a failed launching of the rockets.
Hospital.
And the famous story of El Ahali Hospital is one example of that. And it's maybe likely to be more of those cases in the future because the pressure on Hamas is going to increase. It will be more challenging for them to shoot easily as they used to do up until now. So we may expect another additional incident, something similar to the story of Al Ahali, and particularly when we talk about the fact that now more and more civilians are located in the southern part of Gaza Strip.
Talk me through the difference then. We've had rockets coming out of Gaza. The Houthis fired, I think it was a cruise missile. We also had a rocket that was intercepted by Jordan, fired from Iraq yesterday. And we have seen the full array of Israel's defense capabilities on display, haven't we, in recent weeks?
Well, the Houthis did not launch rockets. These are missiles and, as you said, cruise missiles. This is totally different story. It was intercepted by the Arrow system and by the Israeli defense, by the Israeli Air Force. Those missiles, again, are Iranian-made missiles. The missiles are Iranian. The know-how is Iranian. The guiding is Iranian. The instructions Iranian. Everything is basically, in the end of the day, going back to the Iranians.
They would cause a lot more damage if they were to have a direct hit.
Of course, these are heavy warheads and longer range and so on and so on. And they basically deliberately, of course, targeting the southern part of Israel because they can cover all the way up to the south part of Israel and even beyond. We saw a couple of attempts. And by the way, there has been reports that have not been confirmed that there have been additional attempts to launch cruise missiles and missiles by the Houthis from Yemen. Up until now, they have not been confirmed.
And it really can't be overstated, the difference in capabilities between Hamas and the Houthis and what they're firing. When we're talking about a rocket, we're talking about maybe a dozen pounds of high explosive on the end of this thing. If that hits a building, it's going to take out an apartment building.
Like we saw in Rishon LeZion.
Exactly what we saw there and in some other places as well, including here in Tel Aviv. But the missiles being fired by Houthi rebels, these are intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are cruise missiles with warheads 500 pounds or more. If one of these things makes landfall in a city, we're talking about knocking out at least an entire building. Your mamad, the safe room, is not going to be much of a defense against something like that, which means that Israel has to devote a lot of its resources to intercepting these longer range and much larger scale threats, because if they don't, it's going to be drawn into another theater of war with far greater capabilities, at least when it comes down to the ranged artillery.
And the big nightmare when it comes to missiles is, of course, Hezbollah's capabilities just across the border in Lebanon.
Absolutely, because where we're talking about Hamas's stockpile of 20,000 rockets or so, Hezbollah has 150,000 and not just rockets. We're talking about the same heavy-duty cruise missiles, the same heavy-duty ballistic missiles that we're seeing fired by the Houthis from Yemen, also in their hands. There's also a fair amount of speculation due to the land corridor built all the way from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon and through Syria, that the Hezbollah militias and Hezbollah terror organizations could very well have access to chemical weapons in their stockpiles too. So we're not just looking at conventional threats.
And that's why we've seen Israeli airstrikes on positions in Syria over the past few years.
Absolutely. You've got to keep their airports out of the action, which limits their delivery methods. It doesn't eliminate them, but it certainly limits them. The question is, what does Hezbollah already have in their stockpiles that Israel has to be ready for?
And Avi, I mean, how long can Israel tolerate these missiles pointing from the north?
Well, right now we are looking at something very interesting in the north. Nasrallah is playing with the fire flame. I would say that currently he's scratching what I call the orange line, but he's getting close to the red line. I mean, last night we saw the launching of some 30 rockets. Some of them are heading towards the area north of Haifa. Haifa, I would say, is a red line. And here is something that Nasrallah has to take into consideration. Everything that happens from South Lebanon, even if it's kind of like introduced as something done by Palestinians, it's not. It's Hezbollah, whether he's directly shooting or is giving the permission to shoot. And Nasrallah is playing now with a very dangerous fire, because if he's going to cross this orange line and he's getting closer to the red line, accordingly, the odds or the chance for slippery slope towards a massive escalation is wide open.
All right, okay, we're going to take a short break. Thanks, Avi. Stay with us. More coverage for you after the break.
A month has passed since October 7th, the day Israel was brutally attacked by Hamas. A month since the Black Sabbath, when Hamas terrorists murdered over 1,400 Israelis, wounded thousands of others, and took 240 people captive. A month since the IDF entered a war against the vicious terrorist organization. A month later, I24 News returns to the place where it all began. Join us on November 7th, only on I24 News.
Esta semana en News 24, Israel bajo ataque. News 24 en español trae el análisis y la información de los acontecimientos de la guerra Espadas de Hierro.
Entrevistas exclusivas, reportes desde la zona de guerra, la reacción de los países hispanoparlantes.
News 24, el único medio en español que te mantiene informado y conectado con la comunidad latina en Israel. News 24, únicamente en I24 News.
Made for Me, a unique concept in Israel. Custom-made men's fashion to your measurements. Made for Me, designer of all your events. Schedule your appointment at www.madeforme.co.il. Made for Me, official dresser of I24 News.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Welcome back. You're watching I24 News. We're coming to you live from Tel Aviv on this day 31 of Israel's war with Hamas. While the Israeli leader Benny Gantz says the murder of a Jewish American man in Los Angeles should serve as a stark warning sign to the whole world. 69-year-old Paul Kessler was attacked by a pro-Palestinian protester and later died of his injuries. On Twitter or X, Gantz called on world leaders and the international community to be unequivocal and proactive in their condemnation of terror and anti-Semitism. Earlier this week, a Jewish woman in the city of Lyon in France was stabbed at her home by an assailant. The assailant is still at large. And a rabbi was murdered outside her home in Detroit. Her murderer also still at large. Well, to talk more about soaring anti-Semitism, Daniel Pomerantz is the CEO of Reality Check. He's a legal expert and political analyst. Avi Melamed is with us in the studio as well. So, Daniel, would you say that worldwide police and politicians are taking the threat to Jews seriously?
Not even remotely. And more disturbingly, I don't think Jewish communities are taking it seriously either. For decades now, there have been these marches that we call protests. They weren't protests. They were, at best, hate marches, at worst, attempts at the seeds of a pogrom. At these marches, and I experienced them myself when I used to live in America, they would shout things like, "Death to Jews," they would show Nazi swastikas, and they would scream about the Khaybar massacre, which was a massacre in the 7th century of Jews by Muslims, which included a great deal of going door to door, beheadings and rapings. And if that sounds familiar, it's not coincidence. The massacres of October 7th were intentionally modeled on the Khaybar massacre of the 7th century. We've reached a point where we can no longer hear people say, "This is what I intend to do," and then say to ourselves, "Oh, they don't really mean it," or "They won't carry it out." People are saying quite clearly and honestly what they intend to do to the Jewish people, and we've been ignoring it for decades. It's also worth pointing out that when you call for violence, that's called incitement. That's not protected by the First Amendment, and it's not legal. So the fact that these marches, these aren't protests, these are hate marches, these are incitements to violence. The fact that they're happening at all in countries where they are illegal is a sign that countries are not enforcing their own laws, and that Jewish communities are not calling on their governments to enforce those laws.
Well, I mean, both France and Germany have tried to ban these rallies, and they have gone ahead nonetheless. In the UK, they haven't been banned, but what is banned is open support for terrorist groups, and we have seen, a range of images of people supporting Hamas, supporting Hizb ut-Tahrir, another terrorist group, and there is actually footage of British police officers telling people to put away their Union Jacks and England flags because they have openly said they cannot control such a large number of people. This is quite a dangerous situation for
And it's not true. They can. You know, it reminds me of Brown versus the Board of Education, when the Supreme Court of the United States decided that you can't prevent black students and white students from attending the same schools. When students turned out in Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor of Arkansas said, "We can't protect you. We cannot help you go into school." So what happened? The president of the United States sent in the U.S. military to make sure those students got to school. If the police can't do it, you send in the National Guard. If the National Guard can't do it, you send in the military. If the military can't do it, you send in NATO. But the moment you decide that your laws will be obeyed or not obeyed, just depending on how large and violent the group is the moment you have given up the sovereignty of your nation. And countries around the world, including the countries that claim to have banned these marches, are not taking the measures that they must take and are capable of taking to actually carry out their own laws.
As we've got, Jewish people in major Western cities saying that they're scared to leave their homes, they've taken down their mezuzahs, they won't send their children to school. Jewish schools have been closed. This month is Islamophobia Awareness Month. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say?
Well, Racism exists in a lot of places in the world, and we should fight it every place in the world, and that includes Islamophobia. And if somebody sees fit to try and attack Muslims simply because they're Muslim, that is something we should fight against as well. But right now, at this particular moment, there is no community that is calling for the Khaybar massacre or the Nazi-style massacre of Muslims in any place in the world. That is something that is happening uniquely to Jews right now. And another thing that I find incredibly disturbing, more so even than this death is disturbing, but what I find even more disturbing is the Stars of David being painted on Jewish homes throughout Europe and in the United States. This isn't graffiti. This is not an expression of some. This is a call to action. People are saying this is a home where we want to bring a lynch mob later. We know this because they're saying so. This must be dealt with in the most serious possible way. Any area where we're seeing these painted must have 24-hour security, if not from the police, then from the military. That's how serious this is. It's how serious we should have been taking it 20 years ago, but we must take it seriously now.
Avi, I mean, what do you think about this? Do you think it's become normalized for, I mean, I lived in Europe for many years. You don't have any Jewish schools or synagogues or any Jewish institutions without armed police or private security outside. Do you think this has just become normalized and that people think, well, that's, if you're Jewish, that's how you have to live?
Look, what I think is we see today the bitter fruits of two combined processes that took place in the West for the last couple of decades. One is the slaughter of education. Education was slaughtered for the sake of narratives and sound bites and nice slogans and nice concepts and nice theories. You got a concept or a mindset in the West that was evolving, particularly in intellectual circles, not only there, what I call the knight and the dragon. Meaning people are looking for some kind of like a terrible dragon. They identify Israel as the terrible dragon. They are basically suffocated with idea of like, I'm a knight, I'm fighting for freedom. And from here, the way is very short to see the terrible thing that we see today when people in the West are basically supporting murderers of babies and rapists of their mothers because they view them as a freedom fighter. So this is one outcome of this toxic process that happened. And the other thing that is very disturbing, and I think it was alluded here, we have to think about the growing number of Muslims and Arabs who are in Europe and in the West. Most of them are people that in the end of the day are trying to be part of that society, but there are significant segments of that population that is totally don't see themselves as part of the hosting state. They are totally alienated. And this is the time where they have the opportunity to come and to spread their toxic, hateful rhetoric. Remember, there is a lot of evidence about Islamic preachers in the West who are preaching openly for hating, for crimes, for whatever, against the hosting states and against the Jews in particular. We are looking at a combination of these two terrible toxic processes that happens in the West in the last couple of decades. The West has to wake up.